far from helping me. And as we talked through the nature of this claim, we said several things. One of the things we said is that perhaps this is rooted in some element of David's life, as we would normally expect in a psalm. But this psalm, while there are a couple of things that do tie it to Judaism, tie it to kind of Jewish culture, it is a significantly more, in a sense, agnostic song as it relates to Jewish culture or anything that would give us insight into events in David's life that might lead to this place. We don't really see a time. The closest thing we can come to a time when we might see something like what David is going through would be when he's fleeing from Saul. But as you walk through the psalm, nothing ever really completely comports with what we read here as it relates to some of David's imagery, especially some of the things that we'll see depending on how far we get today. So it's very possible as well that this is one of the psalms that we might understand to simply be prophetic. So rather than it being a psalm of David's life that has prophetic typology in it, that of course when we talk about types, remember what we're talking about. A type is a God-designed or God-ordained symbolism, but it is rooted in an historical event. So there is something that really happens in history, but God also intends that thing that actually happens in history to be a foreshadowing of some greater spiritual truth. And so there have been many of David's psalms where he truly experienced something deep and profound, and he wrote about that, but it's also typologically about Jesus Christ or about some future event, say the kingdom. But in this one, we might have that, or we might simply have a directly prophetic psalm, this one being effectively exclusively about Christ. And we do have a breakup, verses 1 through 21, being about this suffering and about the emotions surrounding that suffering and the absence from the Lord. And then beginning in verse 22 through 31, we see a rejoicing, and messianically, Psalms 1 through 21 are the cross. Verses 1 through 21 are the cross. And then verses 22 through 31 actually is the kingdom. And it leads to the millennial kingdom. And so we see the two advents of Christ there in Psalm 22. So as we said, we began with my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And we see all of the picture of those who have scorned him, those who have rejected him. He says in verse 6, I am a worm and no man, a reproach of men and despised of the people. And yet, in verse 8, when Jesus was on the cross, they said, well, he says that he's the Son of God. Let him come down then, or let the angels come and rescue him. Verse 8 says he trusted on him, on the Lord, that he would deliver him. Let him deliver him, seeing he delighted in him. So there's a mocking, there's a scorning. And we saw in verse 15, verse 14 and 15, he says, I am poured out like water. My bones are out of joint. My heart is... Oh, no, we're not there yet. That's going to be tonight. We're not there. Verses... 9 and 10, but thou art he that took me out of the womb. So there's a confidence in this. And we said that very specifically, that when it says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? This is not a reflection of despair or a belief that God is not present or doesn't care, but rather it's the idea of, God, I'm searching for you and I can't find you. I'm longing for you, but there's something between us. There's a distance there. And that's the flavor of this idea. So now we pick up into verse 12. So we'll get to verse 14 and 15 in a moment. But in verse 12, we are continuing in this theme. There is a little bit of a shift. The reason why I broke it up between 1 and 11 and 12 and 21 is because there is a slight thematic shift here that we do see that lends to the possibility of this being a separate portion to the song, whether it be some sort of chorus or refrain or perhaps not. But as verse 11 says, be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help. So there's no one to help but God. And that's where we pick up this evening in verses 12 through 13. David writes, "Many bulls have compassed me. Strong bulls of Bashan have beset me round. They gaped upon me with their mouths as a ravening and a roaring lion." So we see several different pictures here. We see the idea of bulls encompassing or surrounding him, and then the idea of ravening and roaring lions coming at him with their mouths. Two animals to express his adversaries. Now, when we think of the idea of the bulls of Bashan, Bashan was the northernmost part of Israel, east of Jordan. So the plains of Bashan, they were extremely fertile. So this would be the area up here just east of the Sea of Galilee. That's the area where Jesus would go when he left Capernaum and he wanted to go to a desert place to pray. He would go to that area around Bashan. It's where Bethsaida was. It's a very, very fertile area, and so much so that it would be effectively ideal for livestock. And that's the area here that's being spoken of. And it's being spoken of in this way of familiarity because it would have been. You can see these things from time to time. If the psalmist or a prophet was going to talk about strength as it relates to trees, what expression would he use to talk about strong trees? The cedars of Lebanon. That's right? So it was the area of Lebanon was the area where you would go to get big, strong, beautiful trees, right? The trees of Lebanon. And this is sort of that same idea, the bulls of Bashan. And that's because this area, it was the best pasture land in Israel, and it grew the strongest beasts of burden. So these would have been the place where you would go to get the strong bulls. If you had If you wanted to get the best of the best, you would go get the bulls of Bashan, right? And we do see this idea, the bulls of Bashan, as an idiomatic expression. So very similar to the cedars of Lebanon, the bulls of Bashan. We see it in Ezekiel 39:18. "Ye shall eat the flesh of the mighty and drink the blood of the princes of the earth, of rams, of lambs, of goats, of bullocks, all of them fatlings of Bashan," right? So again, this area of fatness and of strength and of fertility as far as the animals are concerned. And Amos also speaks to it. "Hear this word, ye kine of Bashan, that are in the mountain of Samaria, which oppress the poor, which crush the needy, which say to their masters, bring and let us drink." So this was a somewhat common enough of an idiomatic expression that we see it regularly used in the prophets, right? And then we also did see there, if I go back, the gaping upon him with their mouths as a ravening and a roaring lion. So the bulls of Bashan encircling him, lions coming after him, and this is the picture of the attack that is upon him. We could attempt. You could make a really good sermon out of this and say, okay, the bulls of Bashan, that would be the physical, and then the lions, that would be the spiritual, or vice versa, and make some sort of idea about, as Christ is on the cross, both the spiritual and the physical agony that he's under, because we see two adversaries or two enemies. Not necessary, though, and certainly not something that we could write down in any definitive fashion. It is very common, as you know, in Hebrew poetry, to use a plurality of expressions that all correspond one to another in order to bring clarity or in order to add to the poetic nature. So there's probably simply a synonymous nature to this. The bulls of Bashan, roaring lions, both of them speaking of adversaries, using those two imageries to talk about the difficulty that he's under at this time. Verses 14 and 15. "I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted in the midst of my bowels. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaveth to my jaws. And thou hast brought me into the dust of death." So these pictures are all of weakness and wasting. His enemies are surrounding him, and he is at his weakest. We see the picture here. Poured out like water, thinness. Bones are out of joint, pain or of powerlessness, right? If you have a bone out of joint, if your arm is out of its socket or whatever it might be, it's not usable, right? it's incapacitated, it's handicapped. And so that's the idea here. He's poured out like water. He's thin. He's stretched thin. His bones are out of joint. He's incapacitated. His heart is like wax. The idea of melted. He is melted. And in the idea of his heart being like wax, he's discouraged. He has very little will left in that sense. Melted in the midst of my bowels, or as it relates to his emotional state. Right? That's what the bowels represent. I should have done a slide here on all of the different body parts and what they tend to represent. Organs represent things, right? Especially in the Psalms, we find that to be true. We have here a heart and bowels. The liver and the kidneys would often be used as well to represent different emotional states. Or different metaphysical ideas. So when they talk about the heart as an organ, right? We know that he's not actually speaking of his heart per se. What is the heart representative of in the Bible? The organ of the heart.
Soul.
Okay. Sure, yeah. What does the heart represent? Yeah, soul. Yeah, we could say the mind, right? Or we could say the seat of our emotions. It just depends on what we mean by mind. Obviously, it's not the firing synapses, right? But it's you. It's the soul. It's the seat of your emotional, of your emotions. Not necessarily the idea of the depth of your emotions. That would be a different one. But the kind of the place where emotional, intellectual, soul idea, where you are, right? Jesus says, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Jeremiah 17 says. So we have this idea of the heart being that kind of that seat of you. What about the bowels? What are bowels representative of? It's your intestines. These are the intestines. Representative of? Sarah? No, not love per se. Yeah, this is the deeper emotions, right? This is like the yearning emotions. This is the longing, the yearning, the when you're very upset, when you're very intense, when there's a tremendous earnestness. That would be the idea of bowels. So you often see it that so-and-so's bowels yearned upon something, right? And the idea that their bowels yearned upon something is that they longed for something. They were emotionally invested in something. And we'll talk about the other ones. I'll get a list of them up again at some point, and we can talk about the liver, the call of the liver, and the kidneys. And I think obviously eyes, ears, various feet, various parts of the body that represent things. We'll do that at some point. But we do see both of those here. So the heart being like wax is that he himself, the essence of who he is, his soul, the place of his emotionality, his mind, it is like wax. It is melted in the midst of the emotional stress that he's under. The interplay between the bowels and the heart there. My strength, any thoughts or questions on that? So he says, my strength is dried up like a potsherd. So that would be a piece of clay that is now dry and brittle, right? And so because it's brittle, it's fragile. And so it's dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaveth to my jaws. That would be representative of being thirsty, right? When your tongue sticks, we would kind of see it as your tongue swelling a little bit and maybe sticking to the roof of your mouth. If it's a very, very dry day and you've been working hard and you don't have any water and your tongue kind of gets a little bit dry and sticky and it kind of clings to the back of your throat or to the roof of your mouth, that's the picture. And thou hast brought me into the dust of death. Of course, man, from dust he came and from dust he will return, right? So that's the dust of death there. We talked about these ideas, the bones out of joint as a result of being pulled apart and being incapable. And these, of course, both of these things, the bones being out of joint and the tongue cleaving to the jaw, connect us to the cross. I guess I didn't further speak to that, but as it relates to the hanging on the cross, it would not be an uncommon thing throughout the process for the shoulders to be popped out of joint as they're hanging on the cross. Also, we recall Jesus saying specifically, "I thirst." On the cross, it's one of those 7 sayings of Jesus. And so the concept of the thirst and the bones being out of joint relate us well still physically to the cross. Once again, once you see that picture, you can't unsee it in Psalm 22, right? That this is him hanging on the cross, and as he's hung on the cross, he is going through this tremendous emotional turmoil. His strength is drying up. He is thirsty, and he is dying, right? I am brought to the dust of death. He is dying. For dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. Compass here, compassed, to turn about, to be around, to surround. So once again, we have the surrounding idea. It's the same word as in verse 12 as it relates to the bulls of Bashan surrounding him. So we had the picture of the bulls and then the lions coming at him, and that's a picture of his enemies. And then here we see this picture of dogs surrounding him. And we find some parallelism here, and this is going to help us here. So before, with the bulls of Bashan and with the lions, the idea there was dangerous enemies. But when we look at dogs here, the idea is not a dangerous enemy, but rather a wicked person. And we do see this idiomatic expression carry into the New Testament, right? The Samaritans were called dogs oftentimes, and it was a negative expression a degrading expression to speak of someone as a dog. And we see that idea here. Notice the synonymous parallelism. Dogs have compassed me. The assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. So we see a parallelism between dogs and the assembly of the wicked, and to compass them or to surround them and to enclose them. So we find in that parallelism that allows us to understand what he's saying here and to see the difference between just the idea that enemies have surrounded him and now these enemies are in the wrong. They are wicked men and they are attacking, and the essence of that was that they pierced his hands and his feet. In this, of course, we find prophetic fulfillment. The only time we actually know that Jesus was nailed to the cross in the Gospels is when Thomas is doubting, right? And in John 20, verse 25, the Bible says, "Other disciples therefore said unto him, We have seen the Lord. But he said unto them, Except I shall see his hands, see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe." So the Old Testament prophesied of it. We see that he was in fact nailed to the cross, and then we see it implicitly in Colossians, where it speaks of all of our griefs being nailed to his cross, right? And so we see that idea as well. But that continues the imagery of the cross. It's what we might call the second most clear one, just after my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Clearest connection. Now the thing with this particular prophetic idea is, with Jesus and the my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Jesus, by crying out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? He drew the link to Psalm 22, right? That is Jesus specifically etching out that connection. So that is Jesus's declaration that Psalm 22 applies to him. But of course, the piercing of the hands and the feet was not something Jesus had a choice in doing, right? That was something they did to him. And so this is perhaps the best God-ordained prophetic picture and connection that we have between Psalm 22 and what happened on the cross. And then Jesus made that connection for us by crying out, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Any questions or thoughts on that? He says in verse 17, I may tell all my bones, they look and stare upon me. They part my garments among them and cast lots upon my vesture. Another very, very obvious connection to between Psalm 22 and the crucifixion. The idea, I may tell all my bones, the concept of telling there is to count or to tally them. So the picture here, well, let me ask you, just so that we can stay interactive here. The idea of I may tell, I may count, I may tally all my bones. What would that be reflecting? What's he saying there? I may tell all my bones. I may tally all my bones. I may count all my bones. Any thoughts, Sarah? Yep.
Like, he's being revealed, and that, he doesn't have a lot of clothes on. And when you're under a great stress, oftentimes your bones stand out because the muscles the skin is stretched in such a way that bones can stand out more.
Good. Yeah. So the idea is that he is stretched, he is emaciated, he is kind of shriveled. As his body weakens, all of his bones will start to stand out. Obviously, there's not enough time on the cross for him to go from like fully fed to starving and emaciated in that way, right? He was only on the cross for a few hours. But the picture is of him as he is dying and as he is hanging on that cross, his garments being parted because he has been exposed in that way, and he is withering, right? So that's the idea. I may tell all my bones, or I may count all my bones. The bones are exposed. They part my garments among them and cast lots upon my vesture. Obviously, that's a connection to the New Testament account fulfilled in John 19:24, where they did exactly that. They cast lots for his robe. And both connections are very strong there. So John 19:24 says, they said, therefore, among themselves, let us not rend it, that would be his cloak or his robe, but cast lots for it, whose it shall be, that the scriptures might be fulfilled, which saith, they parted my raiment among them, and for my vesture they did cast lots. These things, therefore, the soldier did. So John quotes here from Psalm 22, once again making the link very, very clear between Psalm 22 and the crucifixion account. So verse 19, But be not thou far from me, O Lord. O my strength, haste thee to help me. Haste should be highlighted there as well. So he says, don't be removed from me. And this is where this is linked to what the beginning said. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Once again, not the idea of despair, but simply the idea of removal, separation. There's a separation between him and the Father. And we linked that to exactly what we believe happened on the cross when he cried out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? The fact that at that point, Jesus was made to be sin for us, who knew no sin. So there was, for the first time in the history of history, a separation between the Father and the Son, a separation between two members of the Trinity, as the Son bore the sin of mankind and thus was separated from the Godhead in that spiritual separation way, because the wages of sin is death. Sin brings separation. Jesus could not bear our sins without experiencing separation. And there's every reason to believe that he did experience separation, because he cries out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? But as we come to the end of verses 1 through 21, we are coming to the end of the crucifixion. And thus, as Jesus is going through that, and we come to this hopeful statement, but be not thou far from me. So he says, why are you far from me, effectively, at the beginning? And then he's crying, and he has his enemies, and they're laughing, and they're scorning him, and they have parted his garments, and they've cast lots for them, and his hands and his feet have been nailed to the cross. And he's experiencing these physical things, but the physical things are in many ways simply a manifestation of the spiritual things that he's going through as he's experiencing this separation. And now he's calling for the Lord to strengthen and to help him and to not maintain this separation from him. Effectively, the idea is that he cannot afford distance from God because God is his only help. So he says, hurry to help me, because the Lord is his only strength. So he says in verses 20 and 21, as the final bit of this first of the crucifixion, deliver my soul from the sword, my darling from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth, for thou hast heard me from the horns of the unicorn. So the idea of deliver here is to rescue. And darling is the word only one. So the reason why they use the word darling there is because it's an endearing term of exclusivity, right? So the idea of a darling one is an exclusive, there's exclusivity there. My darling, right? My only one. There's an exclusive relationship there. But the idea of the only one, and we'll get a little more insight into what he means by my darling. And again, we will use parallelism to interpret this. And then he says, save me, and that's simply the word to deliver, very similar. It's a different word from the deliver in the King James there in verse 20, but a similar idea. For thou hast heard me from the horns of the unicorn. So we have some synonymous parallelisms here. Deliver and save, right? We see that those two are there. Deliver me, save me. Deliver my soul, save me. And then we see this idea, deliver my soul, my darling, save me. So we see in this synonymous elements that help us define. So the delivering and the saving, that's the same concept. The soul is the darling, is him. So effectively, when we see darling in this context, it would be, Father, deliver me, deliver my soul, deliver who I am, right? It's me and only me. Deliver the essence of who I am, my soul, my only soul. I only get one of these. Deliver it from the power of the dog. We've already defined dog as the wicked ones, right? And then the lion's mouth. And we'll see more synonymous parallelism about the enemy here in a moment. That may not be real readable. My apologies for the color. Deliver my soul. We have sword, dog, lion's mouth, horns of the unicorns. And all of these are in parallel. They are all speaking of the same thing. The sword is the dog, is the lion's mouth, is the horn of the unicorn. And these are all speaking of the wicked ones and those who have come against him. But then we come to this question. What about a unicorn? What is this unicorn, and why is the unicorn there? And we don't really know, but we do know this. All throughout secular mythology, unicorns have existed. They are not typically this thing. A horse with this big, long, swirly horn in the front. That is not, there's no real support for that in history. But the idea of a unicorn, there's 9 Old Testament references to unicorns. So it's very hard to imagine that a unicorn animal did not exist. Some say, well, it was the rhinoceros. Possibly something like a rhinoceros. But remember this when we talk about animals or anything of the sort as it relates to Old Testament concepts. You see in Job, you see the behemoth, right? And you see the leviathan. You see the unicorn. And you say, well, these are mythological creatures. Well, why do we assume they're mythological creatures? Well, because they're not around anymore. Yeah, neither are, the snow owls of the... all sorts of endangered species go extinct, right? And so just because something doesn't exist today should not negate the possibility that it had existed at some point. You see dragons in depictions all over the world, right? From multiple centuries. Seems likely that a dragon creature existed. You see unicorns all over the world in mythology, not necessarily always in this format. So there's several possible creatures from history that align with the theoretical unicorn. There's 18th century reports from southern Africa that describe rock drawings and eyewitness accounts of a fierce, single-horned, equine-like, so horse-like animal. One such report describes a single horn directly in front, about as long as one's arm, at the base, about as thick. So very thick at the base, long, and then would thin out a little bit, in the sense, similar to this. It had a sharp point. It was not attached to the bone of the forehead, but fixed only in the skin. And so it was not an extension of the skull bone. It was not like it was a part of the skull, but more like something that would grow, similar to, say, an antler of a sort type thing, perhaps, or something like that. There's also the idea that's a little more like a rhinoceros. This is spoken of several times in archaeology. There also Romans spoke of something like this. Elasmontherium's 33-inch long skull had a huge bony frontal bone, support structure for a massive horn. In the 1849 book Nineveh and Its Remains, he sketched a single-horned creature from an obelisk in company with two-horned bovine animals. So he called it an Indian rhinoceros, possibly also the concept there of the unicorn. Either way, when we come across the unicorn, a single-horned animal, but the thing about them, and this is what we know from something like Psalms, is the horns of the unicorn is linked to, and by the way, horns of the unicorns, right? So probably a herd animal of some sort, linked to the lion's mouth, the power of the dog, and the sword. So it would have been a formidable animal, right? Not something sweet and cuddly, probably, but probably something a little bit more like wild and dangerous, whatever the unicorn was. Questions or thoughts on that? Sarah? In what? In this psalm? Yeah, I covered it today. Yes. So we don't have... This psalm lacks the normal references that would allow us to connect what David is saying to anything in his life. We don't have any hints as to anything in David's life that would really come close to this. When David was fleeing from Saul, he went through some hard days, but probably the most vulnerable part was when he was in front of Abimelech and he had to feign madness. But we have songs directly written about that are cited, written when David had to change his countenance before Abimelech, right? So we have that recorded already. Probably not that. Can anyone think of another really vulnerable time? I mean, there was when he was fleeing from Absalom, another very vulnerable time where there might actually be the kind of physical danger and sorrow that we're reading here.
Somewhat, when he was in the cave, when the king came in to relieve him, Saul was chasing him. Yet he was hidden and the king was unaware of him, but still there was fear. He's trapped.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's possible, although, and again, I'm not 100% sure on this one. There is a psalm of David when he was in the cave, right?
Yeah, he's not too fearful. Then we're saying, let's take advantage of this and kill the king. He says no.
Right.
But so he's sort of trapped there. He might have some emotional trauma.
And that is possible, and particularly maybe in that emotional trauma idea, when he is trying to make the decision as to whether or not to kill Saul, right? Because he has the chance, but he's not going to because he's the Lord's anointed. Sarah?
But he doesn't usually talk about Saul as his enemy.
That's true.
Because he talks about, I will not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. He always approaches Saul as almost a friend who's trying to kill him.
And even as he comes out of the cave, he calls him my father. And I do believe that there is a psalm that exists from when he's in the cave as well. I'm looking for it now. 34 is when he changes his countenance before Abimelech. But anyway, yeah, possible. But because of that, because And with many of the Psalms that we've come to this point, we have been able to say, hey, this is probably when this happened, or it would at least fit very nicely with this element of David's history. We don't see that here. So that leads me to believe that Psalm 22 may have simply been a prophecy. That this is not connected to anything in David's life. This is David in a place of worship, and the Lord gives him a prophetic utterance and has him write a psalm that is intended only and directly to be a prophecy of Messiah. And that would also correspond to the fact that among many of the ones that we as Christians would consider messianic psalms, this is one that the Jews consider a messianic psalm. So they have always connected it to Messiah. Nathaniel.
A couple of thoughts backing up. The gate doesn't add up in my mind. He has the power to kill his enemy. It just doesn't fit. But if we were looking for an instance, how about when Ziklag was taken and their wives and children were taken, and they were so feeble they had to leave so many behind as they pursued on.
Yeah.
That would be a definite emotional.
Yeah, and they were exhausted, and they had to press forward after that. That could definitely be.
I'm not convinced that Psalm 22 is that.
Yeah.
If I were looking for something,
Yep.
then that would be the time.
Yep.
That would be when I would be.
Yep, I would agree with you that would be probably the closest thing we would have to the kind of physical and emotional turmoil. The emotional turmoil could also be connected to Absalom's overthrow, but not the physical, because then he had an entire entourage of people with him. There was no physical strain in that sense, other than connected to the emotional of his son overthrowing and then eventually his son dying. But yeah, Ziklag, I agree. That would be something which, and I would agree with you as well, that I still don't think I think that this is probably exclusively prophetic, but if we were to connect it, yeah, I would agree that would probably be the closest thing. Good. Very good. Anything else? Okay. We have 15 minutes left, so maybe we can finish the psalm here. Verse 22. So there's a dramatic shift here that you can read of determination and of resolution and of rejoicing. So we read, I will declare thy name unto my brethren. In the midst of the congregation will I praise thee. There's been nothing in the psalm to this point that reflects anything like this. And now we have this dramatic transition to praise and to declaration. The idea count, to recount, to relate. It's the same word as tell all my bones in verse 17. And then we'll see in verse 30 the idea of accounted. The count, or the recounting or the relating of something. I will declare thy name unto my brethren. So it's a resolution that though he is going through this time and the Lord is far from him, he will declare the Lord's name. He will praise the Lord publicly. And we do see in this a flavor of victory, a flavor of what we would say messianically resurrection, and I'd say particularly, as we continue through it, a flavor of the kingdom, of the millennial kingdom, the ruling and reigning of Christ, his second advent. First advent, crucifixion. Second advent, ruling and reigning, right? The aftermath of the crucifixion, it's giving way to glory, the determination of the sufferer to justify the goodness of God and to lead others to do the same. Verses 23 and 24. Ye that fear the Lord, praise him. All ye the seed of Jacob, glorify him and fear him, all ye the seed of Israel. For he hath not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted. Neither hath he hid his face from him, but when he cried unto him, he heard. Now let me ask you this. The picture of Jesus on the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Any sort of if that is going to give way to what is being said here, he's not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted. He has not hid his face from him. When he cried unto him, he heard. What would the condition of the sufferer have to be for that verse to make any sense? What's that?
He's already passed away, passed over, died.
Okay.
His body is
Well, yes, but let me ask this though. So you see where we're going with this. If there was if you were seeing a person suffering like this person's suffering, and then there is death, is there any confidence if a man suffers like that, the Lord is far from me, I cannot find him, help me, save me, Lord, and then he dies? Now, in the Christian mindset, because we understand the resurrection, but let's take it outside of that for a moment, would verse 24 make any sense? Would anyone, this guy suffers, now he's dead and he's lying there on the ground, and you say, the Lord has not abhorred him. He has helped the afflicted. He has not hid his face from him. When he cried unto him, he did hear. Well, no, he's dead. He's like lying there dead. That's not that's not help. I guess his suffering's over, right? This reflects victory, right? Which is what you were just saying, Dad. Resurrection. This reflects resurrection. This reflects God heard when he cried out and said, don't be far from me. God heard when he cried out and said, help me. And he brought him to a place of victory. He listened to the affliction, he responded to the afflicted, and he helped the afflicted. And so we see here this very strange giving way, which in the Jewish mind, especially if they're thinking of this messianically, of course, in the Jewish mind, what they do here is they impose Israel on all of this. They say that God is helping Israel and that he'll rejuvenate them and that sort of an idea. But in a singular man-type form, this makes no sense until we learn of the resurrection. The idea that the Lord helped the afflicted as he is dying in this way. He hath not despised, that's to hold in contempt, or detested, abhorred the affliction of the afflicted. And in this we see the praise of God for the character of God, that God is not indifferent to the suffering of his own. And this is one of those things that we find from the resurrection, but we don't often think of. We obviously connect the resurrection to our imputed righteousness and justification, and we connect it to our future resurrection. And as we did on Sunday night, we connected it to the compulsion for holiness and virtuous living. But here we see a connection to this idea that when Jesus rose from the dead and when he was placed at the right hand of the Father, and in that he's coming again, this is God, the Father, responding to the affliction of his child and delivering his son from his affliction, and not disregarding that even in that time where he was taking on the sin of the world, that God did not disregard his son in this time. And this reminds us that God is not indifferent to suffering. This is a hard thing to remember when you are suffering, isn't it? That God is not indifferent, because you feel this way. You feel, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? We can come across this idea of why me, or woe is me, or God, how could this happen to me? Or God, why have you abandoned me? But God is not indifferent to the suffering of his people. Suffering comes for any number of reasons. It's kind of one of those funny things about suffering that on the day or the month or when we step into a new paradigm of suffering that maybe even will last long term, we say, why me? But for the however many years prior to that suffering, we didn't wake up and say, why me? Why is today a day where I'm not suffering, right? Why? We don't question why good things are happening to us. We only ever question why bad things are happening to us. But if we think about this rationally, every day that I wake up alive and healthy, the question, why me, is just as valid as the day that I wake up not healthy and ask, why me? In the day when I have plenty, why me is just as valid of a question as in the day that I have none. Why would God see fit to give me good days? It's just as valid a question as why would God see fit to give me bad days? But we do know this, that God is not indifferent to the suffering of his own. That God does care. That that we do not serve a God who cannot be touched with the feelings of our infirmities, right? Because our Savior was tempted in all points like as we, and yet without sin. At the cry of the afflicted, God hears, and he responds. That should be God is found. God is found of the afflicted. And that may not mean, and we know this, that may not mean that God takes away all of the hardships, right? It may not mean that the health problem goes away, or it may not mean that the pain of some situation goes away, or it may not mean that all of a sudden everything just becomes hunky-dory all at once, but it does mean at the very least the comfort of God, joy, the fruit of the Spirit being born out in our lives, the grace to sustain in the midst of sorrow and suffering. So much so that as Paul dealt with it, he got to the point where he could say, most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Right? Thoughts on this? Yeah.
Just the one other taste I get from that verse 2 is passes over. Liberation.
Mm-hmm.
Freedom. Release.
Very good. Yep. And particularly in a New Testament concept, that is how we see death, right? It is the great release. It's the opportunity to, we talked about it Sunday night, when this mortal will be clothed in immortality, right? We will put off the mortal and we will put on immortality. And that's a day that I know I, among probably many in this room, is truly looking forward to. Not to the extent that you don't love life or you despise life or whatever the case may be, but the idea that the race is run, that the battle is over, that you're no longer dealing with not just the aches and the pains, but you're no longer dealing with all of the frustrations of the sinful body, right? Of temptation and of having to fight the battle. And so there is a true release and a liberation. And at the core, and we do come to this actually, probably not tonight, but we do come to this at the very heart, which is the idea from Matthew chapter 5. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, right? The idea there is I am yielding some of the things that I could have, or the luxuries or comforts of this life for the things of life to come. And that is going to mean a penitent heart, a humility of spirit, a meekness about me, a priority on the things of the life that is to come at the expense of this life, if necessary, which we don't really have to experience much in this country, in this time. But nonetheless, if necessary. And yet that mourning and that persecution and that suffering for righteousness' sake gives way to the glory of the Lord, gives way to freedom, to release. And Jesus did experience that first, right? As it relates to his death. The release from the mortal and then being clothed in immortality is the first fruits of the resurrection. And thus having the fullest reality of the immortal flesh, which is now our birthright, and that which we get to look forward to as well. I've said this several times since my collapse last summer, and please don't take this to mean anything as far as my love for my family or for you all, but I've said to people before, there's just this little part of me that realizes I was this close. I was that close to getting to go home, right? And there was no pain. I don't even remember it. It was kind of an ideal situation, except that, it's not time. It's not my time yet. But there is that little bit that says, man, I was that close to getting all of that, to having all of that, and then this just being done with this, and again, that's not you and my family. That's more the temptations and the weaknesses and the things that a sin-sick world compels us unto.
Paul said the same thing.
Yeah, he did.
He said, I'm ready. I wish I was gone.
Yeah. Yeah, he says it's good for me to stay for you, but I would will that I could, he said, I desire to go home, but for your sake, I desire to stay. And that's a very similar type of idea here. That will to be in heaven, because that's where our heart is. And that's our home. But knowing that it's expedient for the time that we're here, because there's work to do. Good. I think that's, yeah. So we'll stop there. We'll pick up with verse 25 next time. I don't know if there will be, I think there should be enough there. If there's not enough there, I'll be sure to have something else planned so that we can have a full night next week. But we'll pick up with verse 25. But that's, that transition from suffering and sorrow and agony and the feeling of separation to reward and release and liberty and us and the afflicted having been heard, so that he can testify among his brethren, God heard me, right? He did not forsake me. He has not despised or abhorred the afflicted. I was heard of him, and I will testify that among my brethren. And we testify that to the world, right? That the Lord, he's risen from the dead, that the Lord hears the afflicted, and that gives us hope in our time of affliction. Because we have an example, of course, of well beyond just Jesus, of David and of Paul and of so many others whom the Lord heard. But it's a beautiful sentiment in this transition from suffering to victory.
Thank you for listening to Pastor Jamen Wikler from Legacy Baptist Church in Buffalo, Minnesota. More information about Legacy Baptist Church and a library of sermons are available at www.legacybaptistchurch.net.